Pour a glass, clear your mind. It's the History of Wine podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Kaner, and on this week's episode, we are talking Mexico. My last trip to our southern neighbor was back in 1999. I remember dreaming in Spanish, and it made me really happy. Fast forward to current day, there's such an incredible synergy between California's thirst for new adventure and Mexico's rebirth of culinary delights and viticulture. That's why I had to bring in my friend Taylor Grant to uncover the rich wine history of Mexico. She's the founder of Tres Som Wine out of the Valle de Guadalupe, and formerly she was the wine director of Scopa, Dama, and Old Lightning. Vamos a aprender de la historia de los vinos de Mexico. Today's episode is brought to you by Som TV, our worldwide wine and food video streaming service and podcast network. Listeners of the History of Wine can get an entire year 50% off right now by going to somtv.com and entering the code HISTORY. That's $24.99 for an entire year of the greatest entertainment and education in the culinary world. With exclusive originals like Verticals, Behind the Glass, and our documentary on the Rothschilds family, as well as the upcoming next films in the Som series. Som TV is available on all major devices worldwide. Go to somtv.com, type code HISTORY, get 50% off your first year, and start streaming on your smart TV or device now. Pour a glass, clear your mind. It's the history of wine. You probably drink tequila and mezcal or beer more often than you think of wine from Mexico. But what's great about that is their history actually goes back to 1521. When you now think of grapes arriving on the Northern American continent, they arrived first from the Spanish conquest here in Mexico. This is the origin and also the new frontier of wine on our continent. And there's no one I'd like better to bring in to talk about this than Taylor Grant. Taylor's a partner in Tres Som Wine, Dudley Market Restaurant, and also the Jamaica Day and Shark commercial fishing boats. Taylor, it's so good to have you.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's so great. It's so great. I mean, who else would I speak about Mexico with? You are someone who you've completely enveloped yourself in the industry, both in the food and wine side of it. And I'm learning just from watching your Instagram. It's pretty special for me to be able to have that kind of opportunity because I haven't been there since I was 16.
Oh, you got to go.
I know.
I spend as much time as I can down there just trying to learn everything and be a part of the culture, trying to maybe move down there eventually.
I wouldn't blame you. And it seems like obviously the history is rich. There's been some starts, there's been some pauses, there's been war, there's been decrees, there's been bans. We'll get into all that. But now it truly is the new frontier. And we're watching this opening of the minds of people locally. I mean, look, Mexican wines are not inexpensive. And that's part of, I think, what keeps them from being a little bit more obvious in our market here in California. But the quality is amazing. And really the history is so amazing. And so let's talk a bit about that history. You know, these grapes arrive, the Spanish that bring over Vitis vinifera back to 1521 when they're having their conquests on the Aztec Empire. And it was decreed by Hernan Cortez that everyone who came, each colonist needed to plant 1,000 grapevines each year for 5 years. That's an amazing proliferation of vines. What's so great about that? I mean, obviously, God had a big part of this. The missions were so important. And they first started growing grapes in more tropical areas, places like Puebla, Zacatecas. Jokingly, I'm a redhead. My lifelong joke is yo soy de Zacatecas whenever I talk to someone who's a Spanish speaker, because they will believe it. Being a redhead, I could be from there. But these guys had really, unfortunately, poor luck with that tropical climate. How was it they found that the high elevation sites would work best?
Yeah, so, and you're right, in those areas, and specifically Veracruz too, which is where he first came, and that's kind of on that Gulf of Mexico side. So you're really in that tropical climate there.
Right.
But as they went inland and kind of moved through starting around Mexico City and moving up towards the border, they were on this high plateau. Have you been to Mexico City?
No, I know it's high elevation though.
It's high. You're high up there. You're above 7,000 feet up.
Wow.
So
you get drunk fast there.
You do. You got to watch out when you land.
Wow.
But they start planting along this kind of high plateau, and they're, flanked on either side by the Sierra Madre Mountains. But they start moving north towards Coahuila, which they really were looking for gold.
Oh, riches.
Rather than finding gold, they found what they quoted say this oasis.
Wow.
And it was this land of just water and wild vines. And once the conquistadors found this, that's what really inspired these Jesuit missionaries to come up and establish the mission there with the mission grape, the Santa Maria de las Paras in the Paras Valley, which was, a few years before the first winery, Casa Madero, was founded in 1597.
That's amazing. I mean, what's that, 400 years of history? It's crazy.
But in reference to the elevation, I mean, obviously at the lower, more tropical areas, it wasn't going to work because, as you know, this part of Mexico is below the 30-degree latitude.
Exactly.
So you're in a warm climate. You can't plant down in warmer areas. You need that elevation to offset it, to have that cool air, to have that diurnal shift where you get the ripeness, but you're able to maintain that acidity. And that was clear as the grapes were thriving in those higher elevations.
That's really special. And, for them to understand that, to have that European mindset, they had a jump step on what they believed quality to be already, which was special. We'll jump ahead about 100 years, kind of the end of the 17th century. French wine obviously took over the European continent and became so popular. In fact, it actually cut demand for Spanish wines. And one of the things that Charles II had to do in order to help the Spanish wine industry was to ban production of wine in their foreign colonies. And so one of the things that was so tricky about that, obviously there's so much vine that had been planted, investments had been made. What effect did this have on the industry? And also, why were missions potentially the saving grace for that?
Yeah, this period was very tough for the wine industry. And it lasted through all the 1700s, really until independence in 1821. They didn't even have the luxury of, Chile. They kind of were isolated and maybe able to do their own thing a little bit, but not in Mexico. And they weren't able to take off from here. Casa Madero was still able to make wine under the mission, but way less than they could have been making.
Right.
And this was the only way to keep the survival of grapes was through these missions. And so Juan Ugarte, who started planting at the Mission Loreto in Baja Sur, started there. And then they were planted at some of the other missions that were planted up along Baja and Santo Tomas that was just south of Ensenada. But it was very challenging. I mean, they weren't really able to start until, after 1821 or even after War of Reform. It was a difficult time.
Yeah. And so the War of Reform, the Mexican government basically comes in, seizes all the land holdings of the Catholic Church. And you mentioned Santo Tomas. Vineyards like that were sold off to Mexican investors. But in essence, mission vineyards were allowed to just go abandoned, in essence. So how did the industry make this move from sacramental wine, which was so important in the way that it expanded, and then kind of start the transition into something more commercial?
Yeah, it took a while because even after that time in 1857, it took a while to really get started because a lot of these were abandoned, as you said.
Of course.
It was actually, I believe it was around 1870. There was this small gold rush outside Ensenada in San Rafael, which is now the Ojos Negros Valley. And that spurred people to come towards Ensenada. And eventually in 1888 is when the Santo Tomas was sold to a private group and started as an actual commercial winery.
Okay, so that's a beginning for them there at that point.
Yeah, that's kind of the beginning, but see how long that took, and it really wasn't.
Yeah, 40 more years.
It was slow moving, and it wasn't really until the turn of the century where a push started a bit more. One major thing that happened was Russian immigrants known as the Molikans. They were a pacifist religious group, and they were fleeing from the Tsar Nicholas II, and they were offered refuge from Porfirio Diaz, who's the president at the time, and settled in the Valle. And they planted vines, and they brought their experience with them and new energy. And that was a bit of the start. And Porfirio Diaz himself, before the revolution, wanted to expand vineyards. He actually hired an enologist from California, an Italian enologist, to plant 400 hectares of vines in Coahuila and new varietals, Zinfandel. And so this was a start of grapes other than the mission grape.
Right. And Zinfandel today is still doing well, so that worked.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was smart. A lot of forecasting there.
Yeah.
But look, the challenges are not behind them at this point. So even with a new rise in private money and private holdings, the Mexican Revolution happens, then phylloxera happens. These are more things to cripple vineyard land and to kind of hold down the agriculture, not to mention the fact that at that same time, the production of Mexican beer became much more popular. People were drinking a lot of domestic beer. How was wine going to rival as a favorite beverage to to beer or tequila and other things made locally?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge still today. But, it's interesting you say phylloxera, and I now need to call Camila Magoni about this, is what I'm going to do when I get off. But I have never heard of phylloxera in the Valle particularly, maybe in other parts of Mexico, but there's no real record of phylloxera.
Lucky them.
Right? There's all our vines are own rooted. So, knock on wood. But at that turn of the century, they were just starting. I mean, they were kind of past that main period of where phylloxera was crippling everyone else around the world. But regardless, the Mexican Revolution was very difficult. That kind of period of civil unrest, civil war was very detrimental, and most of the vineyards were destroyed or abandoned.
Sure.
So you kind of have this period of they were just starting to get going, and then the revolution comes around, vineyards are destroyed. And in that time, beer production was their time. They were kind of on the rise. I mean, in the last half of the 19th century, that's when a lot of German immigrants were coming in with their beer knowledge.
Right.
That was on a much faster rise than wine at the time. They weren't hit in the Mexican Revolution like wine was. And then you roll into this period of prohibition in the US, where, of course, where are they going to go to get their alcohol?
Yep. The place where it can be made.
The place where it can be made, Mexico. So, I mean, it was opportunity for Mexican alcohol in general,
right,
and specifically beer. We can talk about also the bourbon that was being made in Juarez. Do you know about this?
Yeah, you were mentioning that there was some whiskey production. Do you have knowledge on that? Can you tell us about that as well?
Yeah,
Please.
Definitely. Some, in Kentucky, the second that 1919 hacked hit, they just packed up and relocated down to Juarez, just over the border in Chihuahua.
Yeah.
And one of them was called Waterfill and Fraser. And they actually hired Joseph Beam to make the bourbon down there. Had a distillery. At the time, bourbon was not a protected word.
Right.
So it was, straight bourbon, and it was then smuggled back across the border and sold as bourbon in the States.
So smart.
And you can still find some bottles that say Juarez bourbon on them.
Those have to be so valuable and so sought after. I'm going to start looking now.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love that the Beam family was part of that history too. That's incredible. What a timestamp in history. So
yeah, and then beer, of course. And beer was setting up shop all along the border. In Mexicali, they had the Mexicali Brewery. And the mid-20s is when you had the start of like Corona, Negro Modelo, and eventually the consolidation of those two groups. One of them, Grupo Modelo, which is huge today. But they just really took off at that point. And it's still, the wine industry has not quite caught up with beer.
Well, even here in America, it took, I think in the middle 2010s, the consumption of wine surpassed that of beer. Mm-hmm. And I think now with the pandemic and with economic issues, it's probably coming back to earth a little bit and people are drinking more beer. But when you think about cost ratio, I mean, a beer is going to obviously cost less than a wine bottle. And also you can drink way more beer. That's a bit of it. It has to do maybe with working class, maybe with refreshments. But that German style that was infused in the late 1800s, that style has stayed so clear in beer making throughout Mexico. The light Pilsner lager style, the refreshing, low alcohol. I mean, craft beer, I've seen a few from Mexico. It's definitely taken off near to the border, near to San Diego. But the kind of classic style, that low alcohol, easy drinking Pilsner lager style, it's kind of hard to beat. And I understand why it's been so popular for so long. I mean, a hot day, I want personally a Modelo, or I want, a Tecate or a Corona with a lime. But I mean, wine is just, when you're at the dinner table, when you're thinking about the context of it, and that's, I think, why the Valle de Guadalupe has become so important. The cultural phenomenon around the food there, the gastronomic experiences that you get to have in the Valle with the amazing restaurant infusion and amazing local produce, and obviously the bounty of the sea. What can you tell us about just the way that the food and wine culture in the Valle has come together to really create this experience?
Yeah. And as you said, I think that now the culture is changing to where people didn't even see Mexican wine as going with Mexican food before.
Right.
And that's changing now. And specifically in the Valle, yeah, you're right. The food scene has been a huge help, and it's completely revolutionized their very famous chefs from Mexico and others coming in. They have their, Valle Food and Wine Fest, and like Javier Plasencia has got all his restaurants.
Right.
And that has majorly helped the wine and the region as a whole just to become this destination, where people want to come down. They want to have the whole experience of food and wine. But I think, you kind of mentioned before a little of the taxing. That is and will remain to be a major problem, because right now wine is a luxury, is considered a luxury product and has that extra luxury tax, which is an extra 25% tax on top of 15% tax. It's a 40% tax on wine.
It really hits the consumer.
That is very high. And so trying to compare that to the price of not just beer, but other wines, imported, Chilean wine, US wines, it's hard to compete still. And that will be something that I think needs to change moving forward for it to really be able to compete with those other imports and other beverages.
Absolutely. Well, look, you make wine in the Valle de Guadalupe. You have this great project that you do called Tres Somm. You and two others who I'll let you introduce. Tell us the background, how it came to be. How did you pick the Valle de Guadalupe? I love the wines, but I want our listeners to know how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So the project is called Tres Somm. It's for three sommeliers, myself, Connor Mitchell, and Chris Miller. We all knew each other from just around Southern California, and we planned a trip down to the Valle. I'm from Los Angeles. So I had been down across the border just to, TJ and Rosarito and stuff growing up. But this was different. I had not been to Valle de Guadalupe and it had been a while, and I wanted to check out the wine scene. I didn't know all that much about it. I was opening a restaurant called Dama in downtown that the food was more Latin inspired and Mexican inspired. And I wanted to have Mexican wine on the list, but I had to go down there to see for myself. So we planned this just fun trip down. And the second that we came down through the Tecate side. You're up there in high elevation. You kind of come down through the valley.
And that's where Beachy is, correct?
That's where Beachy is.
Yeah.
And it's just so beautiful. And we started tasting the wines and talking to the people. And there is just this energy down there, the people and the food and the wines that you could feel there was something brewing here.
Right.
And I just wanted to be a part of it. I mean, it was obviously a place I wanted to spend more time. I knew that from the minute that I got there. And we ended up just really by chance meeting Camilo Magoni, who's one of the most famous winemakers in the region. He started making wine for Cetto back in the 60s.
Wow.
Cetto and Domecq. These are the big wineries that have standed the test of time after the Mexican Revolution and until today. And he has all of these varietals planted, he's of Italian descent. He's from Valtellina, moved to the Valle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, moved to the Valle in the 60s to work for Cetto.
This makes a little more sense with me knowing what you produce. So I'm not going to jump ahead of that, but that's interesting to know. Okay, good.
So he had all different kinds of varietals planted, but focus is on Italian for sure. And makes sense since that's where he's from.
Yeah.
But he told us about these experimental plots of Aligote and Fiano, and he said Grignolino, which I got very excited about because of my Italian wine background, and it's one of my favorite varietals. I said, "What are you doing with this?" And he said, "Nothing." And we're like, "What?
Let's fix that."
We got to do something. So that was the start. It was really just, hey, this is super cool what you're doing. We want to bottle a little Grignolino. I want to spend more time down here. We tasted a lot of wines. That was in 2017. I've spent a lot of time down there and able to taste with a lot of different producers and just understand the region better.
Yeah.
For me, I love this project that we're doing, and it's kind of focused on single varietal wines where a lot of the wines are blends there. And so we're doing something a little different. But I love that there is this experimentation and growth, and it's this fresh, new, very old region. And there's a lot of just energy down there and opportunity for growth. And so I'm just happy to be able to be a part of it.
Well, it's great that you're able to bring these wines to our market here in LA, where you live, where you exist, where you do business. I've poured the Rosé of Grignolino by The Glass at Covel. I've also had the Falangina. And I think to show people this fresh style, single variety style from Mexico, they're not used to that. They're used to big blends, Cabernet Tempranillo style things. Sometimes you'll see Nebbiolo, you'll see Carignan, see Zinfandel, but as you alluded to, they're not often single variety. So it's fun to see the mindset, the future forward thinking. How will we get to that point? What do you think is really kind of the next frontier for this young, fledgling, energetic wine region?
Yeah. And you can see every time I'm down there tasting with new people, the styles are evolving. And there still is a need for that kind of bigger style. And you want nice fruit and some warm climate and to kind of stay true to Baja. But there are a lot more restraint coming in the wines, less oak use, or at least less new oak, and kind of more there's, you've got beachy and this kind of more natural wine movement. And there's definitely a lot of changes to, exactly as you said, still the classic like blends. And these blends are so interesting because they're not classic Bordeaux or Rhone blends as sometimes, but a lot of the time it's, Cabernet blended with Barbera and just unusual blends that aren't so classic, but maybe they're classic of Baja now.
Right, exactly. It's what do we have, what makes sense together, and they don't have that old tradition. They don't have the laws holding them back, telling them what to do. And so depending on where the immigrants came from, where their vineyards were, what grapes they had access to, it creates this whole new style and whole new kind of mindset. It's really a fresh take, but it is a little bit different than we're used to. It's not traditional.
Right. We talked a little bit before about Hugo de Acosta and his school, the La Escuelita, where a lot of winemakers were able to learn winemaking techniques, but also understand the terroir. And that was really important to him. And for people who, whether they were from Mexico or immigrants coming in, they didn't have that history. I learned this from my great grandfather and he learned it from his grandfather. As we said, this is a new region. So having that opportunity to learn in the region in the last few decades has spurred this growth. Yeah, every time I go down, there's just a new paved road, a new hotel, which is good. To an extent, I think looking forward, this is the time where you want to expand, but not lose what the Valle is all about. And I think that that's the kind of dichotomy right now. And of course, the biggest issue is really water.
Right. Well, when investments come in, obviously people will do what they believe is best for the area. And then water is going to forever be something they're going to fight over. That will ultimately be a really tough decision that everyone's going to have to make. And we're going to see this in so many regions around the world, but that's going to ultimately be something that holds people back from projects or ability to go bigger. Water's a big problem, big time.
They've been saying it for years, but they hopefully will have a desalination plant kind of set up, outside Ensenada. But Ensenada is just not this big city that can be supplying everything to the Valle. And those who have enough money can kind of have a salination plant on the property or their own wells or whatever. But for most people, that's a very, very small amount of people that have that there. So this is something, that needs to, for any sort of future growth. I mean, we're not planting anything else until there is a concrete solution for water. Right. As much investment comes in, there's got to be a plan for the ability to grow.
These are the kind of decisions people are making all over the world. It's an interesting time to watch this happen, right?
This is not just Baja, for sure. It's this is,
Look, we've learned a lot today about the history of where Mexico has been. We're so excited by the energy of where Mexico is going. And I'm so thankful to have you to help us kind of learn about this, to continue to bring your wines to our market. We're lucky to have them here in Los Angeles. People are lucky to be able to go to Dudley Market. Once again, things open back up. Are you guys available for to-go right now and takeaway?
Yes, we are.
Do that. If you live on the west side, if you live anywhere near to this place, please, this is a time that's necessary to support those who are doing our best to stay open. Such a tough time. And let's hope that also your commercial fishing boats can continue to bring back a beautiful bounty of fish.
I hope so. Yes. Thank you.
Incredible. Thanks for being with us today, Taylor.
Thanks for having me.
So the historical figure for me that stands out from Mexico would be Lorenzo Garcia, the founder of Casa Madero. This was Mexico's first winery back to 1597. Today, it's one of their largest wine producers and the oldest winery in the Americas. Now, while exploring the Mexican landscape, Don Lorenzo came across an oasis with water springs and an abundance of native vines. These were what the first American wines were actually produced from. The place was called Santa Maria de las Parras, or the Holy Mary of the Vines. There's something very kind of awestruck and something obviously very godlike about him as well. Such an amazing continuity, and I can't wait to learn more about this. Until next week on The History of Wine, vamos a tomar más vinos de Mexico. This episode was brought to you by Som TV, our worldwide wine and food video streaming service and podcast network. Listeners of The History of Wine can get an entire year 50% off right now by going to somtv.com and entering the code HISTORY.
White as an Arctic fox, red as a rose. Find the spot on the map as the perfume hits your nose. Pour a glass, clear your mind. It's the history of wine.